to know you.
When World War II ended, the world community seemed to have this clear mission, right? Dismantle empires, usher in a new era defined by self-determination.
And global justice, all managed through the newly minted United Nations.
Exactly. But for one nation in the Horn of Africa, Eritrea, the deal that was struck, looks, according to the research we've done, remarkably like a diplomatic bait and switch.
It does seem that way. We're diving into let's say, the complex legal and geopolitical moves around UN General Assembly Resolution 390V that was adopted back in 1950.
Okay.
And our source materials, they don't just treat this as some historical footnote. They really frame it as a defining moment where international law was, allegedly sacrificed.
Sacrificed? How so?
Where the rules were essentially rewritten for the sake of power, as one analysis puts it. Right there in a region critical to the emerging Cold War.
High stakes indeed. So let's set the scene a bit. Eritrea had been an Italian colony. After Italy's defeat in the war, it came under British military administration.
That's right. And its future became the UN's problem to solve.
Before any big decisions, a UN commission actually went there in 1950, didn't they? To sort of gauge the local feeling. What did they find?
They found clarity, which, makes what happened next so. Well, frustrating if you look at it from the perspective of self-determination.
Clarity, like?
The commission confirmed that the overwhelming majority of Eritreans wanted full, immediate independence, period.
So the people's will was clear. They had their mandate.
Absolutely. But when the decision finally came down from the UN, it pretty much ignored that mandate entirely.
And this is where that post-war idealism, the UN Charter's promise, smacks right into the paranoia and strategic thinking of the Cold War.
Precisely. Why was independence deferred?
Yeah, what?
Because the world map had just been split. You had two major ideological camps forming. And Western powers, they looked at that Eritrean coastline along the Red Sea and saw something incredibly valuable from a strategic point of view.
A choke point. Command over one of the world's most vital shipping lanes.
Exactly. So allowing Eritrea to become fully independent, maybe non-aligned, maybe even leaning the other way, that was seen as just too big a strategic risk.
Okay, now here's where the analysis gets really sharp, because the sources we looked at highlight one particular statement. It seems to just strip away all the diplomatic niceties.
Ah, you mean the Dulles quote?
That's the one. The moment where self-determination seems explicitly traded for realpolitik. This comes from U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, speaking quite openly before the UN.
What did he say exactly?
He said, and I'm quoting here, "Although the Eritrean people deserve their independence, the United States' strategic interests in the Red Sea Basin require that the country be linked with our ally, Ethiopia."
Wow. Just out there.
Right.
The candor is almost brutal, isn't it? Dulles wasn't really even trying to hide that this policy was driven by American military needs, by strategy, not by the legal or moral rights of the Eritrean people.
It feels like that single admission basically greenlit decades of future conflict, all because of geography and Cold War calculations.
It really did.
Yeah.
The implication is stark. The ideal of self-determination just yielded completely to the logic of hegemony, specifically American military strategy.
So Ethiopia was being positioned as the West's, what did one source call it? Proxy gatekeeper to the Red Sea.
That's the term used, yeah. And this wasn't just a casual alliance.
How so? What did that partnership involve?
It was comprehensive. The sources detail how post-war Ethiopia, under Emperor Haile Selassie, became, one analyst calls it, a political entity engineered under Allied and U.S. patronage.
Engineered.
Meaning substantial financial backing, military aid, strategic alignment, all designed to build a strong counterweight against perceived Soviet expansionism in the Horn of Africa and the Middle East.
And it wasn't just theoretical support, was it? There were concrete assets involved.
Oh, absolutely. You have to think about Kagnu Station in Asmara.
The communications base.
A massive, vital U.S. military communications intelligence base. Hugely important for global monitoring and relaying information during the Cold War.
So linking Eritrea to Ethiopia essentially secured the long-term American presence there.
It guaranteed the lease on Kagnu Station. No need to negotiate with a potentially unstable or even unfriendly, newly independent Eritrean government. It secured the asset.
But the price for that security
was Eritrean self-determination. That's the argument presented.
So this narrative you sometimes hear about a historical reunion between Eritrea and Ethiopia, The sources argue that's basically a Cold War invention.
That's the contention, yes. It wasn't about history. It was about creating a structure that served Western strategic goals, ensuring a reliable ally, Haile Selassie's monarchy, controlled that crucial coastline, and protected those key Western assets like Cagnu.
Okay, which brings us squarely to the legal instrument used to make this happen. UN Resolution 390V, adopted December 2nd, 1950.
Right.
So independence was off the table. Outright annexation wasn't really acceptable to the international community just yet. So what did the resolution actually do? What kind of relationship did it set up?
Well, the resolution tried to find a middle ground, a political compromise, let's say. It mandated that Eritrea would constitute an autonomous unit federated with Ethiopia under the sovereignty of the Ethiopian crown.
Federated, so not fully independent, but not fully absorbed either. Ethiopia gets control over foreign policy, defense, things like that.
That was the idea. Sovereignty rested with the Ethiopian crown, but Eritrea was supposed to have significant control over its own domestic affairs.
And the whole point of a federation, especially one mandated by the UN, is that there are specific guarantees of autonomy, right? What exactly did the UN promise Eritrea it would keep?
And this is crucial. The guarantees looked really robust, at least on paper. That's what makes the later events seem like such a betrayal of the legal framework.
What were they?
The resolution said Eritrea would maintain its own constitution, which actually had to be approved by a UN commissioner. It would have its own parliament, its own independent judiciary, its own separate administration for local matters, even its own flag and control over its own budget.
Its own flag. Wow. So real symbols of self-governance. The key phrase was significant autonomy.
Exactly. Significant autonomy.
But if the UN created this federal structure with these specific guarantees, why didn't it work? Why didn't they create some kind of enforcement mechanism to protect those rights?
And that, right there, is the central flaw, the pivotal failure of Resolution 390V, according to these analyses. The moment the resolution passed, the document suggests Ethiopia started treating the federation not as a partnership, but as a temporary phase, like dependency just dressed up in legal language.
So the failure was baked in from the start?
It seems so. Because ultimate authority, sovereignty, rested with Ethiopia, maintaining Eritrean autonomy relied entirely on Ethiopian goodwill. And in that Cold War context, with strategic interests paramount.
Goodwill was in short supply.
Extremely short supply. Non-existent, you might argue.
Let's trace how those guarantees were eroded. Because it wasn't like a switch flipped in 1962. The sources describe it more like a gradual strangulation.
That's a very important point. It wasn't sudden. The process started almost immediately after the Federation began in 1952.
How so?
Well, within just a couple of years, sources document the suppression of Eritrean political parties, shutting down newspapers that were critical. The Eritrean police force was quickly integrated, centralized under Ethiopian command.
Undermining local control.
Definitely. Then, a really symbolic move. In 1956, the autonomous Eritrean flag, the one guaranteed by the UN setup, was banned.
Wait, they banned the flag the UN resolution specifically allowed?
They did. Replaced it with the Ethiopian flag. It was a clear signal about who was really in charge, undermining that symbolic sovereignty.
What else?
Well, the Amharic language, Ethiopia's official language, was increasingly imposed in government business and schools, sidelining Tigrinya and Arabic, which were Eritrea's official languages under the Federation.
So cultural and administrative assimilation.
Yes. And by 1960, reports suggest the Eritrean judiciary's independence was severely compromised. Ethiopia's appointees were increasingly influencing or overruling local decisions. It was all preparing the ground.
Preparing the ground for the final move, which came in 1962.
Correct. After a decade of systematically weakening the autonomous unit, Emperor Haile Selassie just unilaterally dissolved the federation entirely.
Just like that.
Just like that. Declared Eritrea the 14th province of Ethiopia. Full annexation.
Now, the sources we've reviewed are absolutely clear on the legal status of that action. They define the 1962 dissolution as a fundamental act in violation of international law. Why is that the crucial legal point?
It's crucial because Resolution 390, the UN resolution, established the only legitimate basis for any Ethiopian authority over Eritrea. That basis was the specific structure of the federation.
The contract, so to speak?
Exactly. The resolution never gave Ethiopia the right to annex Eritrea or to dissolve the federation on its own. So when Selassie did that, he didn't just break an agreement. He effectively destroyed the very legal foundation that granted Ethiopia any authority there in the first place.
So the argument, legally speaking, is that this unilateral act in 1962 basically nullified any lawful Ethiopian claim to sovereignty over Eritrea from that point on, according to international law and the UN's own resolution.
Precisely. From the perspective of the international legal instruments that created the Union, the annexation was illegitimate. It became essentially an occupation, not a lawful political integration. And this legal argument became the bedrock for the long struggle that followed.
And it's important, I think, to connect this back to some of the historical narratives you still hear sometimes. Attempts to frame this differently, suggesting Eritrea was just a lost province naturally returning to Ethiopia.
Right, that revisionist take.
What does the actual legal and historical records show about that?
Well, the UN archives, the specific text of Resolution 390V, and perhaps most damningly, Dulles' own candid admission. They all point in the opposite direction. Meaning Eritrea wasn't considered a lost province by any recognized historical, legal, or diplomatic standard accepted by the international community in 1950. It was a distinct former colony whose future was decided by an international mandate, a mandate that was then violated. Its territory, as one source historically puts it, was held only by violation, not by right.
So the denial of independence back in 1950, followed by this illegal annexation in 1962, that directly lit the fuse for the 30-year armed struggle for independence.
It seems unavoidable looking back. That conflict wasn't just some internal rebellion. The sources frame it as a fight fundamentally rooted in that initial legal betrayal and the subsequent breach of international law.
It was the almost inevitable consequence when the legal path was blocked.
That's the powerful argument made. When the UN failed to uphold its own resolution, and when Ethiopia illegally annexed the territory, the Eritrean people felt they had no choice but to fight to reclaim the independence that was first promised, then legally structured, and then violently taken away.
So Eritrean statehood, achieved in 1993, it wasn't something granted or kindly restored by the world?
No. The narrative here is clear. It was earned. Hard-won through decades of sacrifice based on upholding the legal truth that was established, and then violated right back in the 1950s and 60s. Earned through sacrifice and truth, not given.
This has been a really sobering deep dive. We've traced the path from, a UN promise of self-determination through the cynical calculations of Cold War strategy to a formal legal contract that was systematically undermined and then violently breached.
And that breach necessitated a decades-long, incredibly costly fight for independence.
So what's the final thought for you, our listener, to take away from this?
I think the lasting question, the one that resonates even now, maybe 75 years later, it isn't really about the historical ties or lack thereof between Eritrea and Ethiopia. The bigger issue highlighted by these sources is, why did the international community, specifically the UN system, allow its own foundational principles like self-determination and its own legal mandates to be so fundamentally compromised?
Compromise for the sake of power politics.
Exactly, for the sake of geopolitical advantage. What message did that send then, and what message does it continue to send today to smaller nations or peoples who look to international law for protection and justice? That's the really provocative question to keep asking.